Imagine discovering a secret that would transform your understanding of desire, spirituality, and the deepest parts of yourself forever. What if everything you've been taught about balancing spiritual evolution with your most intimate impulses has been incomplete, fragmented, divided against itself? The ancient wisdom traditions knew something we have forgotten, something that Western psychology is only now beginning to recover through the lens of analytical depth. You are not broken for feeling both the call toward transcendence and the surge of primal creative energy coursing through your body. You are not conflicted for being both a seeker of higher consciousness and a being of flesh, desire, and sensuality. This paradox you feel, this tension between your spiritual aspirations and your sexual nature, is not a problem to be solved, but a message waiting to be decoded. If you're resonating with this, if you've ever wondered why, the deeper you go into spiritual practice, the more intensely your desires seem to awaken, then subscribing to this channel will transform how you navigate this sacred integration. We're building a community of people brave enough to explore these territories without shame, without fragmentation, and you'll get access to our entire series on the sacred union of sexuality and spirituality, released weekly with practical insights that will reshape your self-understanding. Check the pinned comment and description for the full progression of content we're creating together. This is the beginning of a journey toward your wholeness. Now back to this revelation that has the power to shift everything you thought you knew about yourself and your desires. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the landscape of the human psyche with unprecedented depth, discovered something that most spiritual traditions seem to deny or suppress. Within each of us exists what he called the shadow, the repository of all that we have rejected, denied, cast aside, or deemed unacceptable within ourselves. This shadow is not inherently evil or destructive. It is simply the totality of what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. And here is where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary for your spiritual journey. Your sexual desire, your erotic impulses, your creative vitality as embodied in sexual energy. These are not aspects of yourself to transcend, purify, or overcome. They are not lower impulses to be conquered by higher consciousness. Instead, they are dimensions of your wholeness demanding recognition and integration. For centuries, particularly within Western religious traditions, sexuality was compartmentalized as sinful, base, and fundamentally opposed to spiritual advancement. The more you prayed, the more you fasted, the more you denied your body, the theory went, the closer you came to God or enlightenment. This binary thinking has fractured the human experience into irreconcilable opposites: spirit versus matter, soul versus body, divine versus animal, love versus lust. But Jung understood what alchemists had long intuited, that the union of opposites, what he called the conjunctio, or sacred marriage within the psyche, represents the pathway to individuation, the becoming of your truest, most complete self. Your desire is not your enemy. Your sexuality is not a stain upon your spirituality. They are complementary forces, two expressions of the same fundamental creative energy that moves through existence, that births stars and blooms flowers and births new human consciousness into the world. Think about the actual experience of sexual attraction and arousal in your body. What you feel is pure, raw, creative force. What ancient traditions called kundalini, what mystics described as the serpent fire coiled at the base of the spine. This energy is not separate from spiritual energy. It is the same energy, the same vital force that animates all life. When this energy remains trapped, unexpressed, denied, and repressed within you, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It becomes what Freud called neurosis, and what Jung understood as the pathological effect of refusing the totality of one's nature. The repressed sexual energy doesn't make you more spiritual. It makes you dissociated, fragmented, living in a constant state of internal civil war between your higher self and your lower self. This internal conflict then manifests outward in countless ways: compulsions and addictions, explosive anger or depressive flatness, creative blocks, difficulty forming authentic, intimate connections, a constant background hum of anxiety and shame. You cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot transform energy by denying its existence. But the moment you turn toward your desire with curiosity rather than condemnation, the moment you ask, what is this energy telling me about my creativity, my power, my capacity to connect with another human being? Everything begins to shift. Consciousness flows into the previously split-off parts of yourself, and integration becomes possible. Consider the lives of many spiritual seekers you might know or have heard about. There is often a particular pattern that emerges with a frequency that statistics alone cannot explain away as coincidence. After years, sometimes decades, of rigorous spiritual practice, of meditation and renunciation, and the cultivation of higher states of consciousness, something unexpected happens. The repressed sexual energy, accumulated and pressurized over time, erupts with tremendous force. The guru becomes entangled in scandals. The monk breaks his vows. The devoted practitioner suddenly engages in behavior that seems to contradict everything they have built their identity around. What is happening in these cases is not that the person has failed spiritually or that they were never truly evolved. What is happening is that they have attempted to build a tower of consciousness without a foundation, to elevate themselves into higher states while ignoring and repressing the foundational energies of embodied human existence. At a certain point, the repressed returns with compulsive force. The denied does not stay denied. It seeks expression. And because it has never been integrated, when it emerges, it often emerges in destructive, unconscious, and deeply problematic ways. This is why Jung's approach offers a radically different pathway, not denial of desire, not transcendence through suppression, but conscious relationship with every aspect of yourself. What does this conscious relationship look like in practical terms? It begins with a foundational shift in your internal dialogue. When you notice desire arising in your body, when you feel the spark of attraction or arousal, instead of the immediate conditioning that says, this is wrong, this is base, this is pulling me away from my spiritual path, you can pause, you can breathe, you can ask, what is this? Not from a place of judgment, but from genuine curiosity. What is this energy showing me about my aliveness, about my capacity to create, about my need for connection and intimacy? The very act of conscious attention transforms the quality of the experience. Energy that has been repressed and denied begins to move again. It becomes available not for compulsive acting out, but for conscious integration and expression. You can begin to experience your sexuality as connected to, rather than separate from, your spirituality. The depth of passion you feel with a beloved partner becomes a doorway into profound connection, into the dissolution of the separate ego self, into union. This is what sacred sexuality actually means, not the purification of sexual energy into something supposedly higher, but the full presence, consciousness, and reverence with which you meet your desire and your partner. Many ancient spiritual traditions understood this with clarity that we have largely lost. In Tantra, one of the most sophisticated and misunderstood spiritual systems, sexual union is recognized as a profound spiritual practice. The union of masculine and feminine principles, understood not as gender, but as complementary energies within each being, becomes a path to awakening. The Taoist sages taught detailed practices of sexual energy circulation, recognizing that through conscious sexuality, practitioners could access states of meditation, healing, and higher consciousness that were otherwise difficult to attain. The alchemists of medieval Europe encoded their spiritual transformation in the imagery of the sacred marriage, the union of the Red King and White Queen, representing the integration of fire and water, heat and cold, solar and lunar energies. These were not primitive people groping in the dark for spiritual truth. These were sophisticated masters of consciousness who understood that the attempt to transcend the body was a fundamental misunderstanding of what the spiritual path actually is. You cannot transcend what you are. You can only transcend what you deny. The moment you say yes to your embodied nature, the moment you reclaim your sexuality as a dimension of your wholeness rather than as something to overcome, the very foundation of your spiritual work shifts. You are no longer trying to escape yourself. You are trying to integrate yourself, and this is when genuine transformation becomes possible. Jung's concept of the shadow extends beyond sexuality. But sexuality is perhaps the most poignant and personal arena in which we can observe this dynamic. Your sexual nature, your erotic imagination, your fantasies and desires, these are often the very things you feel most shame about, most compelled to hide, most convinced are evidence of your moral failure or spiritual inadequacy. A woman might feel ashamed of her desire for power within her sexuality, her attraction to confident or dominant partners, interpreting this as evidence that she lacks spiritual development. A man might feel confused and guilty about the tenderness or receptivity he desires to experience sexually, having internalized the message that such things are somehow unmanly or unspiritual. These internalized shame narratives create splits in your psyche that run very deep. The part of you that desires is cut off from the part of you that prays. The part that wants to dominate is separated from the part that wants to surrender. The part that seeks intimacy is divided from the part that seeks transcendence. And you experience this division as internal warfare, as a fundamental brokenness in your nature. But here is what Jung would tell you. Here is what the integrated psychological view reveals. You are not broken. This division is not your nature. It is a wound inflicted by culture, by conditioning, by collective messages that have told you to hate and fear and deny the sexuality that is woven into your being. Your work is not to transcend this sexuality. It is to heal the wound, to retrieve the disowned parts of yourself, to bring them into relationship with your conscious self. This is the real spiritual work. This is individuation. The alchemists spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of the great work where all is reduced to chaos and darkness. This descent into the darkness of the shadow, into the encounter with what you most want to deny and reject in yourself, is not failure. It is the necessary first stage of transformation. You must know your shadow before you can integrate it. You must look directly at your desires, your fantasies, your longings, your erotic nature, without the filter of shame or self-condemnation, before you can begin to integrate them into a more complete and authentic self. This looking is not an invitation to act out every impulse without restraint or care for others. Integration is not the same as indulgence, but it is radically different from repression. There is a vast middle way between acting out your unconscious desires in destructive ways and repressing them entirely. That middle way is conscious relationship with what you desire. It is understanding the difference between your fantasies and your true values, between what turns you on and what aligns with the kind of person you want to become, between impulse and intention. This discernment is only possible when you stop treating your desire as an enemy that must be vanquished and start treating it as a part of yourself that deserves understanding. When you encounter this material in another person, when you see a partner's sexuality, their desires, their fantasies, their erotic nature, you have a choice in that moment. You can react with your own conditioning, your own shame and fear and internalized prohibitions. You can become the carrier of collective dysfunction, passing it on, perpetuating the division and fragmentation. Or you can become someone who brings consciousness to this encounter. You can meet your partner's sexuality with curiosity rather than judgment, with openness rather than fear. You can recognize that their desire, like your own, is not a sign of brokenness or inadequacy, but an expression of their aliveness, their creativity, their capacity for connection. The quality of presence you bring to your partner's vulnerability becomes the safety within which they can begin to heal their own shame, to integrate their own sexuality into a more complete sense of self. This is one of the deepest gifts one human being can offer another. The witness consciousness that says, I see you, I see all of you, including the parts you have been taught to hide, and you are not diminished in my eyes. You are more whole. The integration of sexuality and spirituality in your own life becomes the foundation for more genuine spiritual practice. It is not that sexual practice replaces meditation or prayer or study or service. It is that these dimensions of your life become more integrated. Your spiritual practice is no longer something you do to escape your embodied reality, but something that deepens your presence within it. Your sexuality is no longer split off from your values or your spiritual commitments, but woven throughout your entire life. You become more present in your meditation because you are not at war with your own body. You become more authentic in your relationships because you are not compartmentalizing different aspects of yourself. You become more creative and productive in your work because the same energy that has been locked in internal conflict is now available for conscious expression. The wholeness you seek in your spiritual practice is not something that can be achieved through rejection and denial. It is achieved through integration, through the hard and sacred work of retrieving every disowned aspect of yourself and bringing it into conscious relationship with the rest of your psyche. This is what Jung meant by individuation. This is what the spiritual masters of the ancient world understood when they spoke of enlightenment, of liberation, of the marriage of heaven and earth within the human being. Practically speaking, what does this mean for how you approach your sexual life? It means becoming more conscious about your own desires and fantasies, understanding what they might be communicating to you about your own power, creativity, and capacity for connection. It means having conversations with your partners about sexuality that go beyond the mechanical, what do you like, into deeper territory. What does this touch mean to you? What do you need to feel safe expressing your vulnerability? What would it feel like to have your sexuality witnessed and honored rather than judged? It means cultivating what sex researchers and therapists now call sexual integrity, the alignment between your sexual expression and your deeper values and sense of self. It means understanding that genuine sexual fulfillment is not primarily about technique or physical sensation, but about the quality of consciousness and authenticity you bring to the encounter. The most spiritually developed sexuality is also the most honest sexuality, where what you actually want and who you actually are can be present without the layers of pretense and performance that most of us have learned to wrap around our sexuality. There is also a shadow side to spiritual sexuality teaching that deserves to be examined with honesty. Some modern teachers and teachings have tried to spiritualize sexuality in ways that are just a repackaging of the same control mechanisms, just dressed up in different language. Sacred sexuality teaching can sometimes become another way to judge and control your sexuality, to impose new standards of correctness about how you should experience your eroticism, what positions are conscious, what fantasies reveal spiritual inadequacy. This is not integration. This is just repression with a spiritual gloss. True integration means finding your own truth about your sexuality, developing your own conscious relationship with your desire, without adopting someone else's ideal or standard. You must become your own authority on what feels true and authentic in your body. This is a radical act of self-trust that many of us have never been invited to cultivate. We have always been told what to want, how to want it, when it is appropriate to want. the invitation to truly listen to your own desire, to honor what your body is communicating, to distinguish between your authentic longings and the conditioned responses you have internalized. This is the real spiritual work. There is a particular pattern in the psyche of many sincere spiritual seekers that is worth examining with compassion and honesty. There is often a split between the aspiration for transcendence and the reality of being embodied, and this split can create a situation where the person moves further and further away from their authentic self in pursuit of an idealized spiritual image. They adopt certain practices, ethics, and behaviors that they believe will make them more evolved, more spiritual, more worthy of enlightenment. But these practices and ethics, rather than emerging from genuine understanding and integration, emerge from compliance with an internalized spiritual ideal. There is a quality of striving, of effort against the grain of who they actually are, of saying no to aspects of themselves that are not going away, but are simply going deeper underground. The person becomes increasingly split, increasingly performing a version of themselves that they think should be spiritual. And under this performance, the shadow grows larger, the repressed grows more pressurized. The distance between who they are presenting themselves to be and who they actually are increases. At some point, this structural instability in the psyche gives way. The unconscious material erupts, or the person becomes increasingly anxious and depressed, or they lose the motivation to continue the practice that was never really rooted in genuine understanding. This is the failure not of spirituality, but of a particular approach to spirituality that is based on denial and rejection rather than on integration and understanding. The alternative pathway Jung offers is more demanding in some ways, but ultimately more sustainable and more transformative. It requires genuine self-knowledge, which means looking honestly at your desires, your shadow, your contradictions, without the comforting illusion that you can transcend these through spiritual practice. It requires developing relationship with every aspect of yourself, including the parts you wish were different. And from this foundation of genuine acceptance, genuine integration, authentic spiritual practice becomes possible. There is wisdom in the recognition that you are a unified being, not a committee of warring parts, all trying to pull you in different directions. The part of you that seeks transcendence and the part of you that seeks pleasure. The part of you that values commitment and the part of you that craves adventure, the part of you that wants to be held and the part of you that wants to dominate. These are not enemies, they are all you. They are all valid expressions of the full spectrum of human experience. And the measure of spiritual maturity is not how successfully you have eliminated certain aspects of yourself, but how skillfully you have learned to hold multiple dimensions of yourself in consciousness simultaneously, how much you have integrated previously, split off or denied parts of yourself into a functioning whole. This is not a return to unconsciousness or an abandonment of growth. In fact, it is the deepest kind of growth, the growth that comes from embracing rather than rejecting your nature. The Taoist symbol of yin and yang illustrates this beautifully. Within the darkness is a point of light, and within the light is a point of darkness. Completeness is not the elimination of one pole in favor of the other. It is the dynamic dance of both poles, each containing seeds of the other, neither complete without the other. Your sexuality and your spirituality, your embodied nature and your transcendent aspirations, your desire and your wisdom, these are not enemies locked in eternal battle. They are aspects of a complete human being learning to dance together. When you begin to understand your sexuality in this larger psychological and spiritual context, something shifts in how you relate to your own desire. It is no longer something to be ashamed of or to be proud of in a reactionary way. It becomes something to be curious about, to understand, to bring consciousness to. you begin to notice the patterns and conditioning that have shaped your desires and your sexual responses. You might notice that you are attracted to a certain type of person and recognize this might be related to unresolved dynamics from your childhood or your culture. You might notice that you have certain sexual fantasies, and instead of immediately judging them as evidence of your depravity or your spiritual failure, you can ask, what is this showing me about my own needs? What disowned part of myself is asking for recognition? This kind of conscious exploration is not self-indulgent. It is the royal road to self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is the beginning of all genuine transformation. You cannot change what you do not understand. You cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. But the moment you bring consciousness to your desire, the moment you can hold your sexuality in the light of awareness without flinching away, something begins to shift. The energy that was locked in repression becomes available for conscious expression and integration. The shame that was binding this material begins to loosen, and you move toward greater wholeness, greater authenticity, greater freedom. Imagine the freedom of a sexuality that is not at war with your spirituality, that is not split off from your values, that is not burdened by shame, but rather infused with consciousness and authenticity. Imagine being able to desire and be desired without the internal conflict, without the fragmentation, without the sense that some part of you is always disapproving. Imagine experiencing your embodied nature as an expression of your spirituality, rather than as a distraction from it or a threat to it. Imagine bringing your full self, your passion, your vulnerability, your power, your tenderness, into your intimate relationships without the armor of performance or the walls of protection that keep the genuine self hidden. This is not a fantasy or an idealized state available only to the particularly evolved. This is the birthright of anyone willing to do the work of integration, anyone willing to turn toward their shadow with compassion rather than condemnation, anyone willing to reclaim the whole of themselves rather than continuing to fragment and divide. This is the sacred integration that Jung understood and the ancient wisdom traditions knew, that the path to wholeness runs not away from our humanity, but through it, not in denial of our embodied nature, but in full embrace of it, not in transcendence of sexuality, but in its conscious integration into the tapestry of a fully human and fully spiritual life. Você não está sozinho neste conflito, nesta busca, neste desejo de integração. Milhares de pessoas ao redor do mundo estão começando a despertar para esta mesma verdade, que a divisão entre espírito e corpo, entre desejo e devoção, entre sexualidade e espiritualidade, é uma ferida que pode ser curada. E na nossa comunidade aqui no canal, estamos construindo um espaço onde essa integração é possível, onde você pode explorar esses territórios sem vergonha, com profundidade e com o apoio de outros que estão no mesmo caminho. Se este vídeo ressoou com você, se reconheceu algo de sua própria experiência naquilo que exploramos juntos, deixe um comentário nos dizendo qual foi o insight mais importante para você. Compartilhe este vídeo com alguém que você sabe que também está buscando essa integração. E se ainda não está inscrito, este é o momento de fazer parte dessa jornada de autoconhecimento transformador, onde semana após semana trazemos conteúdo profundo e prático sobre psicologia, espiritualidade, sexualidade consciente e a integração de todas essas dimensões em uma vida mais autêntica e plena. Obrigado por estar aqui, por estar disposto a olhar essas verdades sobre si mesmo. Este é apenas o começo. The integration process you are now beginning to undertake is not a journey that happens in isolation. It requires patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to revisit your conditioning with gentle but unflinching honesty. Many people who attempt this work become frustrated because they expect immediate transformation, a sudden dissolution of shame, a rapid healing of the splits they have carried for years or decades. But integration is a process, not a destination. It unfolds gradually as you bring consciousness to previously unconscious material, as you practice new ways of relating to your desire, as you build new neural pathways and emotional patterns. Be patient with yourself. The shame you feel about your sexuality did not arrive yesterday. It accumulated over your lifetime, reinforced through countless interactions, messages, and experiences. It will not dissolve in a single meditation or through one insight, however profound. What will begin to happen, if you commit to this work, is that you will notice the shame arising, and instead of being consumed by it, you will be able to observe it. You will be able to ask, where did this come from? What am I actually believing about myself in this moment? Is this belief true? This observing capacity, this ability to witness your own mental and emotional processes without being completely identified with them, is the beginning of real freedom. This is the meditative awareness that both Buddhist psychology and Jungian psychology are pointing toward, though they use different language. As you develop this capacity, the grip of shame loosens, the condemned parts of yourself begin to come forward, and the possibility of genuine integration opens up. One of the deepest truths about sexuality that is often overlooked in both spiritual and psychological discourse is that your sexual nature is fundamentally connected to your creative power. The same energy that generates erotic desire is the energy that flows through artistic creation, through passionate engagement with work that matters to you, through innovation and the bringing of new things into being. When you repress your sexuality, when you push this energy away and refuse its presence, you are not just limiting your sexual experience, you are damaging your creative capacity across all domains of your life. People who have done significant work integrating their sexuality often report a simultaneous flowering of creativity in other areas, better writing, more innovative thinking, greater boldness in pursuing their vocations. This is not coincidence. It is the natural result of having more energy available. It is what happens when you are not exhausting yourself maintaining internal divisions and repressions.